From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. As the Trump administration already failed at MAGA, failing to drain the swamp and making America great again, are the president's economic policies leading us to a fiscal Armageddon? Does our guest believe Trump has done some good as the great disruptor? Plus some radical beliefs on America First foreign interventions. The brilliant, controversial David Stockman joins us tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. David Stockman was one of the key architects of the Reagan Revolution, reducing taxes, attempting to shrink government, increasing the defense budget. Thereafter joined Salomon Brothers on Wall Street, was a partner at Blackstone Group, founded his own private equity firm. He's the author of The Triumph of Politics, Why the Reagan Revolution Failed, and The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America. He was a guest on our show for that. He's formerly from Greenwich, where we do this show. This book is just out, Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp, and the Fantasy of MAGA. Welcome back, Dave.
Happy to be with you.
And as I was telling you this week in emails, I love data-driven stuff. We're living in this era where everything is fake news now. So you've got a great foundation for this. I will go after you a bit on Bill Browder and Putin. I've had him on several times. I think you have that reversed.
Okay.
But we'll get to that later. Now, you've been a contrarian. The whole deal, the Reagan Revolution, your book failed. Now you think Trumponomics is failing. A lot of people obviously think Trump's economic side is at least going. Tell us what you mean. Why have you seen both of these in such a contrarian mode?
Well, let's talk about Trump. He inherited an economy that was already weak and struggling. In month 90, the third longest business expansion in history, it was saturated with debt that had been building up for the last 30 years, public and private. We had a wake-up call in 2008 with the crisis. There was $53 trillion of debt on the U.S. economy, public, private, household, business, government, finance. But instead of heeding the wake-up call and delevering, we just doubled down. When Trump came in, the debt was nearly $70 trillion where it is today. And this economy is struggling and suffocating under that debt and the lack of real productive investment, plant and equipment and technology. Instead, what's been going on is corporate America has been cycling its balance sheet and its cash flow into financial engineering, massive stock buybacks, huge M&A deals, that neither of which really adds to the productive capacity, efficiency, or growth ability of the economy. So that's what he inherited, and the question was, did he have any policy agenda that was going to reverse that $70 trillion debt mountain burden or the massive underinvestment in our economy, or the bloated costs, wages, prices, and costs in our economy that have resulted from the Fed's really misbegotten 2% inflation target for the last 30 years in a world where we're now the highest cost supplier, and that's why we've had a huge trade deficit and offshoring of productive middle-class jobs and such weak wage growth and no growth at all, actually in real terms after inflation. The answer is no. He had no program whatsoever. You're not going to solve that problem with tariffs. You're not going to solve that problem by doubling down on a $700 billion deficit at the federal level he already inherited and raise it to about $1.2 trillion this year, as he has. And you're not going to solve that problem by telling the Fed to print more money and repress interest rates and distort the financial markets even more than he inherited at the time he took office. So what I'm saying is it's all been, really ass backwards, if I can use that term, and it's taken a weak economy and it's set it up for a giant fall. Even then, he's embraced this economy, which was a huge mistake, and what he called a big, fat, ugly bubble in the stock market in November 2016, when it was at 2140, he said was a vindication of his policy when it peaked last fall at 2940, 800 points higher. My point is that was the peak of everything, the stock market, the economy, and Trump. And it's all downhill from here because policy is fundamentally in a destructive mode.
Let me ask you, do you think Trump knows what he's doing?
No, he has no idea. He's an economic imbecile, and he's dumber than a post when it comes to fiscal policy. Anybody that knows anything would have recognized that when you're in the tail end of a business cycle, which we were when he came in, month 90, no one has, outlawed the business cycle or outlawed recessions. One was right around the corner, regardless of what he did. So to come into that phase of the business cycle and then double down on the federal deficit at a time when the baby boom is now starting to, scramble into the retirement ranks at 10,000 a day, and then to compound, add insult to injury through massive increases in defense spending and filling up the real swamp, which is on the Pentagon side of the river of the Potomac. That was all as dumb as it comes. I have no other way to describe it. But the guy spent his whole life borrowing money.
I was going to say he was the king of debt on Wall Street. So.
Yeah, well, that's right. But he spent his whole life riding the bubble that's been created since 1971 when debt and easy money became the regime after Nixon, basically deep sixed the Bretton Woods system and the anchor to gold. And took a few years, but we were off to the races with the Fed and debt in the public and private sector. Now we have an aging, lame economy, and we have the king of debt, a guy who became a billionaire because he thought he was a genius, when actually he became a billionaire because he rode the bubble that was being created by the policies that he is now doubled down on. So,
Okay, let me ask you. We've got, the Reagan tax cuts. Now we've got the Trump tax cut, and we've got low unemployment. The market is up. These corporate rates are down. We've repatriated all these monies that were stuck overseas. You don't see any of that that the tax cut is not going to have the same effect of the Reagan tax cuts, which also generated deficits of their own.
Yeah, well, first of all, I was there, and I've written a whole book on it. The Reagan tax cuts were well-intended, but they got overwhelmed by the deficit that resulted from the explosion of defense spending, the failure to cut domestic, and we ended up with a 6% of GDP tax cut rather than the 3.5 or 4 that we targeted. You put all that together, the deficits overwhelmed the incentive or supply-side effect of the tax cut, and here's where it cuts to the chase. From 1954 to 1980, real GDP growth averaged 3.55%. During the 8 years of Reagan, it averaged 3.57%. In other words, there was no difference in the trend growth rate, notwithstanding these tax cuts, and it set the stage for deficit-financed based policy that has gotten us into deeper and deeper trouble as the decades progress.
That's interesting. You have an interesting statistic here that that if you take the inventory swings out of GDP, which makes sense because the tariffs, right, are 2.69% is the Trump growth rate, 2.55% was the Obama growth rate. So we don't have a huge increase there either.
No, the point is when you inherit the economy in month 90, either in a few years you're going to roll over into the next recession, which always happens. There's only been 2 of 10 business cycles that long since World War II. So you either had a magic potion that was some kind of economic Viagra that was going to kickstart an aging economy, at 90 years of age, so to speak, or you were heading into trouble. And what has happened is that Trump's claim that this tax cut and other minor deregulations he did have kickstarted the economy, but it's an illusion. As I go through it carefully in the book, in the second and third quarter of last year, where growth was 4.2% and 3.5%, there were 2 big distortions in there. One is the trade war that was just getting ahead of steam caused exports to be pulled forward, which added almost a point to growth. And then secondly, everybody got a big tax cut in their pocket, So on a one-time basis, they took the savings rate down to rock bottom. That added to consumer spending and a temporary kick to GDP. But you know, there's the morning after. You pay for it. Now we're adding $2 trillion to the deficit, and that's going to crunch the bond pits as the federal government tries to finance it. Just finally, as the central banks are beginning to realize they have gone way overboard and have to shrink their balance sheets after this fantastic growth, again, which I document in the book, that has been going on for the last 2 decades.
This is the Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, over 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the internet, get our archive of podcasts, talk about the undrainable swamp in the second segment. And we're back with David Stockman, author of Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp, and the Fantasy of MAGA. One more thing on the economic performance we were talking about. You're calling for or predicting a 50% stock market decline, which is pretty scary. You're basing that on what, just the debt issue?
Yeah, I was just saying 50% from the peak Trump, which occurred September 20th when the market topped out at 29.40. We're not going to see that for years and years to come. If you expect a recession, which I'm sure we're going to have, nobody's outlawed them. Earnings in a recession will drop from about 130 a share in the S&P today to 70, 80, and even put a aggressive multiple on that. And you've got a stock market at 1,500, not 3,000. There's your 50%. The issue is not so much the drop. It's going to happen. It always does when the bubble breaks and the recession arrives. The question this time is it going to be a V-shaped bounce back so you can ride it out if you got enough, liquidity and staying power, or are we in a new world where we bump along the bottom for years and years in an L-shaped pattern because the central banks have finally shot their wad? They're out of dry powder. They got interest rates barely above the zero bound. They have no room to cut, and their balance sheets got bloated beyond belief. And the people need to understand that the Fed's balance sheet alone, since the year 2000, went from $500 billion to 4.5 trillion. And for the world, all the central banks, they're all doing the same thing, and it's part of a global financial current. Went from 4 trillion in 2004 to 25 trillion a little while ago. Now, it is that massive central bank balance sheet expansion, which was nothing but buying assets, driving up their price, driving down the bond yield with fiat credit, coming right off the digital printing press, that has created a totally bubble-ridden, unstable, artificial financial system and inflated asset prices, which can't be sustained in the long run, and will be punctured badly as the central banks belatedly try to normalize and recapture some of their powder, but it's too late.
What is the ratio that makes you like Greece or you collapse? What is that number?
Well, I don't think anybody ever knows because we're in uncharted water, but there have been some academics, including, the Harvard economist, I'm not picking his name out right now, that pretty well demonstrate when countries go over 90% debt to GDP, bad things start to happen. I don't know that there's any magic, but what I do know is that we're in a totally different dynamic than we've ever been in the last 30 years. And that is, for 30 years, governments have been expanding their debt and deficits, and the central banks have been buying up the debt, like some kind of pooper scooper brigade going behind the treasuries, picking up all the debt. And so the impact in terms of pushing interest rates up and squeezing out private investment was minimized. Well, that was false. It couldn't be done forever. It was central banking run amok, but now they've pivoted. The Fed has pivoted. It had to QT, and so instead of scooping up all the debt the government is issuing, they're actually beginning to dump the existing debt that they bought over the last couple of decades in order to shrink their balance sheet. So now you have in the bond pits of New York and the world, governments selling huge amounts of new debt and central banks dumping large amounts of old debt, and the law of supply and demand has not been repealed, and therefore it's going to shock the system with lower bond prices, higher yields, and the whole stock market is based on low bond yields.
I assume you think the trade war tariffs are kind of dumb. China's stealing $300 billion a year of our intellectual property. Is what Trump doing is kind of getting that through the back door, so it might be good, or just dumb?
I think it's dumb. I mean, I don't know whether China's stealing $300 billion a year or not. I mean, you can't believe these numbers that are put out by self-serving business lobbies and even the organs of the government. I mean, it comes from USTR and the Commerce Department, and Wilbur Ross, who should have retired a few years back at least. And it's self-serving. They want to be the mavens of trade. They want to be the czars of global trade, so they need a reason. But here's the point. Even if the Chinese are stealing intellectual property, that's not a function of government to remedy. That is a function for business. If business is being hurt, it needs to spend money to protect its intellectual property, and that's why there's a $100 billion internet security business out there. They need to spend money to do it because that's part of the price of doing business in the world. If they go to China so that they can and have operations there so they can get on CNBC and brag about the growth that's going to come to their earnings from China, they are required by the Chinese to share patents or intellectual property. That's their doing. That's not a function of Washington, some trade nanny in Washington. If they don't want to give up intellectual property to their Chinese partner, don't go to China. It's that simple. Now, I realize we have a huge trade deficit in merchandise goods with China, but that problem is because of the Fed. The Fed has inflated the hell of the domestic economy, and as a result, we can't compete, and that's where the imbalance comes from. So if you want to solve the merchandise trade imbalance, which is terrible with China, $380 billion, then we got to get our costs and wages in nominal terms down, and we have to stop subsidizing the middle class to live beyond, have a living standard beyond what they're earning, because most of those dollars go into buying trinkets and goods from China.
While we're on China, the last couple of minutes of this segment, you call it the Red Ponzi, $40 trillion debt bomb. What's going on in China? Where are they heading?
Well, it's not a capitalist economy. It's a communist system, okay? And, they found out that Mao was wrong. Power doesn't come from the barrel of a gun. It comes from the production end of a printing press. So the Chinese have been printing money like there's no tomorrow. They have taken their debt from $500 billion in the late 90s to $40 trillion today. That's an 80-fold increase in barely 2 decades. When you have that much credit, you can build anything. So they've built from one end of the country to the other fast, high-speed rails and highways and airports and all the rest of it, and plants capacity far beyond anything that can be efficient or productively used. And the thing is, GDP is based on spending. GDP is really a Keynesian measure that people don't really fully understand. But you could build pyramids in every state in the United States at a tune of $1 trillion a year, and the GDP would go up. But a couple years later, the debt, would come back to bite you hard. This is what China's been doing, essentially building a huge economic pyramid equivalent.
Time bomb.
And a time bomb. And they're going to have the depression of all time in China one of these days, and then the true Mao will come back to life. In other words, power will again have to come out of the barrel of a gun because the prosperity will collapse, which has kept the Chinese Communist Party in power.
Okay, the third segment coming up, we're going to get some radical recommendations from Mr. Stockman.
Money, 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 money. You got to have it. When you need it, what do? If you don't have a rich uncle, Call LendingTree. With us, hundreds of banks compete for your business, so you'll get loans with competitive interest rates, and in some cases, with no closing costs. So here's the deal. If you need money, call us. Do you want to refinance your current loan? Are you 62 or older and interested in a reverse mortgage? Then call LendingTree now. 888-794-1645. 888-794-1645. We've closed over $250 billion in loans. We know what we're doing and can help you. Call right now for a free quote. 888-794-1645. 888-794-1645. 888-794-1645. That's 888-794-1645. NMLS number 1136.
Back with David Stockman. He was a Reagan revolutionary. Now it seemed pretty libertarian to me when we go through some of his radical stuff, as I call it. And we'll look at the foreign side first. You're calling for the Defense Department to basically be shrunk from $770 billion in Trump's second year of funding to $250 billion. You say Russia's got 7% the GDP of us, are not a threat at all. You want to disband NATO, take 100,000 troops out of Japan, 35,000 out of Germany, 20,000 over Korea. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking that we're not an empire, we're a republic. I'm thinking that we're not the global policeman of the world. We can't afford it, number one, and second, it doesn't work anyway, and third, it isn't needed. I'm thinking the Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union shuffled off the pages of history. The whatever military threat they posed is long gone. I'm thinking U.S. and NATO combined has 36 trillion of GDP. The GDP of Russia is 1.5 trillion, a minor fraction. I'm thinking that all of this vast expense that we have for 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, forward projection capacity, airlift capacity, conventional war-making capacity, tanks, all the rest of it, totally unneeded in the present world because the homeland is safe from invasion and we have a nuclear deterrent bought and paid for and fully effective and costs very little to maintain. So if we understood what our security really depended on, not what the military-industrial surveillance, congressional Washington, imperial Washington consensus wants to keep the prosperity flowing and the $1 trillion-a-year warfare state funded, we could easily get by with a homeland defense, a nuclear deterrent, and a budget that wouldn't, destroy our fiscal equation.
I was interested in one stat you had here. The Russian defense budget is apparently $61 billion, so that's less than 10% of ours. But our intelligence community, those 17 agencies alone, their budget is $75 billion.
That's right.
It does seem...
In other words, we spend more on gathering intelligence and basically meddling in everybody's affairs in the world, tapping everybody's telephone from Angela Merkel to everybody else in the world, interfering in elections, overthrowing governments like we just did in Venezuela a couple days ago. We spend $75 billion doing that compared to Russia, which spends for procurement, research development, soldier pay,
weapons,
material supply, weapons, fuel, and even spare boots, only $61 billion a year.
And vodka, probably.
Yeah, well, and vodka too. But look, they have only one aircraft carrier. It's 45 years old.
You have a picture of it in the book.
Yeah, it's a diesel-based, smoke-belching can of junk steel sitting in the Mediterranean. We have 11 carrier battle groups. There's no way that Russia could threaten the shores of New Jersey come hell or high water. The second point is really important, is that the people who live near Russia know that. Because if you look at what Germany spends, and they're not a Pacific people, they're not a bunch of pacifist wimps. They've invaded the world twice in the last century. They spend $41 billion a year on defense, 1.2% of GDP, and if Russia was about ready to come through the Brandenburg gates, they sure as hell would be spending more on defense. In other words, the litmus test is right there in what Germany and France and Italy, or even the old Warsaw Pact countries, they're right on the border, right? And what does the Czech Republic spend, or Bulgaria, or Romania? They all spend 1% of GDP, including all the crybabies in the Baltic states who, thrive on politics by saying big bad Russia is on their border. Europe proves, Trump is right and wrong. He's right in saying they're not pulling their fair share. Their defense budgets are nothing compared to what we spend. But he's wrong because they're right in what they're doing. They don't need to spend anymore because Russia's not about to invade them or anybody else, and the whole Ukraine thing is not evidence of that. It's something we fomented when we supported the coup in Kiev in February 2014 and put a bunch of nationalist crypto-Nazis in the government, control of government. And all the people in eastern Ukraine who are Russian, the country's been divided for centuries between Russians and Ukrainians, were alarmed immediately and begged for help from Russia. Now, the thing about the Crimea annexation is really ridiculous, okay? Because Crimea has been part of Russia for 200 years since Russia bought it from the Turks, and there hardly a Ukrainian lives there. They're mostly Russians, Tartars, and other nationalities that want nothing to do with Kiev. So we have these idiots in Washington beating their breasts and, demonizing Russia and Putin because they annexed Crimea when, nothing was annexed. The people there didn't want to be any longer part of the Ukraine. Now, we got to be an independent country because we declared independence in 1776. We busted up Yugoslavia because we didn't like the regimes. Czechoslovakia became two countries because they didn't feel compatible. So what's wrong with Crimea and the Donbass, which is eastern Ukraine, Russian-speaking, going their separate ways? This is just the war machine looking for a reason to fleece the taxpayers of America.
Wow.
But the problem in this world that we live in today is that Washington is now populated in both parties, with what I call residents of the imperial city who think they're running the world and are constantly imagining, enemies that don't exist.
All right, I want to talk about this Bill Browder thing. First of all, you say there's no collusion issue, and that Mueller's actually part of the deep state trying to deep six Trump's desire to have peace with Putin, forgetting if he's owned by him or whatever. But and in Syria, you say some of the chemical attacks you think were faked. So those ones are hard for me to grasp. But Bill Browder now, you talk about him. In my mind, and from what I've studied out with Bill, he had the corporate ID of some of his companies stolen. He was entitled to $230 million of tax refund for those companies. So he is not going to steal his own tax refund or steal the ID of his own companies. The Russians did that. And then they killed his lawyer, Magnitsky, as he tried to investigate it. And Putin has continued to kill people on foreign soil. To me, the Magnitsky Act that came out of this is a good deal because it's these Russian mob oligarch characters that are stealing the money and that are the danger, not the poor Russian people. You present a story that basically Browder's the bad guy and the Russians are the good guys.
Yeah, well, I don't think Russians are good guys or bad guys, and I don't think we're the indispensable nation and the somehow God conferred angels of the world. We're all just normal people that do good and bad things. But whatever happens in a Russian prison is none of our goddamn business, okay? And I don't know what the right and wrong of this story. The Russians say that Browder violated the law, bought his and his syndicate bought a huge amount of Gazprom stock illegally, and we're trying to get the money out of the country, and that's where the whole fight went. But I want to tell you, the biggest evil in Washington for the last 6 years is the Magnitsky Act. It was totally wrong. It was the United States saying our law can prevail in your country, and we can decide to sanction your citizens, private or government, because we don't like what went on in your country, at least based on the facts that we have. I think that is imperialism. I think that is nonsense.
What about when they're killing people on foreign soil?
I don't know. We kill more people on foreign soil than any other country in the world, okay? The CIA has assassinated more people than the Russians ever imagined doing. So, we got to have a little perspective here and understand that somehow we don't have a God-given right to assassinate people, and I don't even know that the Russians do. This latest thing with these two people in the UK, I've looked at the facts of that carefully. I doubt seriously what that had anything to do with Russia or with the alleged poisons that came out of a factory that was dismantled 25 years ago. But anyway, I think Browder is really a bad guy. I think, his record speaks for itself. He gave up his citizenship in 1999 because he didn't want to pay taxes in America. By the Russians telling of it, he stole billions from the Russian people in the transition from communism to whatever they have today. And he has spent all that money lobbying Washington to engage in a vilification campaign against Russia and Putin and this ridiculous Magnitsky Act that really is what's brought the world to the verge of a second Cold War. He is literally almost single-handedly responsible for turning a working but somewhat tense relationship with Russia in the pre-2012 period into an outright confrontation. The Democrats have just picked up on that in order to explain how they lost the election to the single worst candidate ever fielded by the Republican Party in its entire history, including Barry Goldwater and Alf Landon in 1936.
How do we get out of this fiscal Armageddon? The final segment coming up. Our final national segment with David Stockman. He was the OMB director under Reagan. Is there any way to save us from this impending fiscal crash? Sometimes you sound like you want to go back to the gold standard. You also talk a lot about deflation, which to me kept Japan in the toilet for a generation. How can we get out of where you think we're heading?
We may be in so deep, we may have been going in the wrong direction so long that there is no clean or stable or manageable way out. I think we're now going to have a thundering financial crisis that basically causes a clean slate to be had and, discredits everything. The Fed, this fiscal policy that we've had and the fact that we're, the whole economy is operating on debt levels that are far higher than can be sustained. And I'm not just talking about the federal government either, with $22 trillion of debt today going to 40, but the business sector of our economy now has $14.5 trillion of debt. The household sector has $15 trillion of debt. And these are numbers relative to income that are, off the charts. So there is not a formula for a smooth, manageable, steady transition. It's going to be a shocking crisis that finally causes us to move in a new direction. It happens rarely in history, but in the 1930s it did. I think the direction taken was wrong, but there was a fundamental shift in direction during the New Deal. We had one that we tried and didn't get too far, but it was a basic shift with Reagan in 1980. We did get rid of double-digit inflation and the stagflation of the 70s and so forth. We paved the grounds for the debt problem of today, but it was a big shift. We've been drifting, bipartisan drift, don't do anything, kick the can, and double down on what you're doing for 30 years since then. So I think in the 2020s, we're going to have a big 1930s-type crisis driven by this debt, the financial bubbles, and a economy that is almost stopped growing on a trend basis. And, we're going to have a very difficult time.
Now, do people say to you, well, David, you've been calling for this back since the Reagan Revolution, that this is going to happen now. Something did happen in 2008. But you just see, what's your basis now for that is coming right in the 20s?
Well, because Greenspan became Fed chairman in 1987. The Reagan deficits were about ready to plunge the economy into a deep recession. It would have been discredited at that point. In other words, big deficits and debt. Greenspan stepped in and he pulled out the stops at the Fed and began the process of massive monetization of the public debt and Fed balance sheet expansion and intervention in the financial
So they're
market.
out of ammo is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, so 30 years, the Fed has deferred the day of reckoning for 30 years, but when when Greenspan took over, it's a very important statistic, the Fed's balance sheet was $200 billion, and it had taken them 73 years to get there from the time that the Fed opened for business in 1914.
Yeah.
At the peak, it was $4.5 trillion, so just think about that. You basically had a massive expansion of the balance sheet in that 3-decade period, and that distorted everything. It basically allowed the government to run up a deficit massively. It encouraged corporations to borrow like there's no tomorrow, and not to invest, but to buy back their own stock and do M&A deals and other things that have weakened the growth capacity and competitive basis of American business. And, that's all part of the picture. It goes on a lot longer than you can imagine, or that should have been possible, but I think we've now reached the Rubicon.
So we shouldn't be spending a time building a wall, eh?
It's a total distraction, a complete waste, not only of money. $5.7 billion is a couple hours worth of federal spending, not even that, okay? The issue is there's no crisis on the Mexican border. That's totally fabricated by Fox News to get viewers. But unfortunately, Trump is such a dunderhead on these things that he's fallen for it lock, stock, and barrel, totally obsessed by it, and is, consuming huge amounts of political capital in a totally, wasted diversionary.
In fact, you point out we need younger workers to come into this country for the demographic purposes.
Yeah, I think people ought to know that basically the native-born population isn't procreating for whatever reason. They're not making babies, and therefore, and that's already baked into the demographic cake, the native-born workforce is now shrinking at over 1 million a year. And so if we don't have big immigration, we are not going to be able to pay for the Social Security and Medicare benefits of 80 million baby boomers who are going to all be retired, within a matter of 10 years or so.
Do you think Trump serves out his term?
I think it's touch and go. I think if we get the big stock market correction that I expect, he is going to be in deep trouble because he embraced the thing, and the Democrats will kill him with it, and the Republicans will go hiding in the cloakroom like they did for Richard Nixon when I was there as a kid in 1973 and 74. Everybody was saying then, the mainstream media, well, what's wrong with the Republicans? Why aren't they standing up to him? No, they were just in the cloakroom hiding and mumbling about how bad the situation was. And finally, when the stock market dropped 37% between January, 1973, when he was inaugurated with this huge landslide victory, by August 1974, it was down 37%. The Republicans came out of hiding, sent in Al Haig to tell him to get on the helicopter and get the hell out of town. That's how it's going to work with Trump. Whether that happens before the next election or not, I think remains to be seen.
Do you think this, they always say a crisis is a great thing to waste. If you end up calling this one right, is that going to be a good thing for a turnaround or not?
It probably won't be a good thing. It's going to be very painful, and there's going to be millions of innocent victims of this, particularly the middle and working class, just like is always the case. But I think we're in so deep that no one's going to do anything about changing the direction unless a crisis forces, a redirection of the whole system and policy.
Well, it's a contrarian look at things, and it looks like it's ahead of the curve on stuff. And the book is just out. I've been talking to David Stockman. It's Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA. You've been listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Dave Stockman. Thanks to our national audience for listening. We'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. All talk and all crime. The nation's biggest murderers were the go-to source for the Moxley murder and the Skakel appeals. Financial crimes on Wall Street. Inside the crimes of Russia's Putin and more. The facts, the forensics, the inside stories. From the host of Business Talk with Jim Campbell, it's Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. All talk and all crime.
Learn more about Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell by visiting Park City Productions 06604's Facebook page. That's Park City Productions 06604.